Supply chain. There are three main oyster species in Australia: the Pacific oyster, the Sydney rock oyster, and the native flat Angazi oyster. Pacific oysters are farmed in Tasmania, South Australia, and New South Wales. Sydney rock oysters are farmed in New South Wales and southern Queensland. Native Angazi flat oysters are farmed in small amounts across all states, Western Australia, South Australia, and Tasmania. Juvenile oysters are called spat. The spats or seeds are then put into trays or bags, which are held above the seafloor. Growth of the oyster depends on the season and environmental conditions, such as food availability. The oysters are then harvested by lifting the bags to surface and removing the mature oysters. The oysters are then cleaned, graded, packed, and prepared for transport to the processing centre, the retail outlet, or the restaurant. Many farmers are now selling their product at oyster bars next to their farm. Processing.
When it comes to shucking oysters, you don't need much equipment at all. A chain protective glove, another glove, and an oyster shucking knife. With me today, I've got two oyster shucking knives. I'm going to show two different techniques of shucking oysters. When it comes to shucking live oysters, you need to identify a few different things. Obviously, this top flat part of the oyster is called the lid. The round sort of part at the bottom is called the base. You also need to look out to make sure that the hinge around the whole oyster is sealed and there's not leaking any water. And the oyster should appear to be heavy. That way it's holding all those lovely juices that make the oyster taste so great. And where you want to shuck these ones from is the hinge. So basically, if you get the oyster and it sits inside your hinge, you know you're in the right place to start. So first off, I'm going to demonstrate shucking with a short blade knife. The reason I like to use a short blade when shucking oysters is because you've got a lot more control over it. The blade isn't as long and you can really guide it with your hand. But you do need to shuck it in your hand. So, chain protective glove, if you do have a slip, you should be fine. Okay, so we want to find the hinge of the oyster here. Apply a little bit of pressure, and then as soon as you see the oyster knife go in there or you hear that popping sound, you just give it a little bit of a twist up and the oyster comes open. So now you want to be careful now not to release that lovely juice in there. So once you're up on that lid, you want to tilt it to the side and come around to cut that muscle tendon. So as soon as you cut the muscle tendon, the top lid will come away. You can discard this. So as you can see, we've got the lovely oyster in there with still lots of this juice inside. We've got a little bit of chip shell in there, so we just want to brush that away with the knife, get away with any sort of little grit or sand in there. Then we're going to cut this last muscle band straight down, and we're going to turn our oyster over. Still maintaining all those lovely juices, a perfectly shucked oyster. When it comes to shucking oysters with a long blade, it's important that you have a secure point, like shucking on the table. We basically put it in the centre of the tea towel, we cover it up, exposing the hinge. So now once we find the hinge with the oyster, we basically give it a little bit more pressure and a wriggle, and then as soon as we get that pop, we know the oyster's up. Once again, making sure we don't slide in there and damage the oyster, we lift it up, we cut around, we cut that muscle band, not losing those lovely juices, clear away any shell or grit that you see. So we cut that muscle band, turn over the oyster, and a beautifully shucked oyster, full of all its juices.
Receiving and storage.
Good morning, chefs. Best oysters in town have arrived.
G'day, Grilly. How are
How are
you,
you, mate? All good. Check those. 20 dozen of the best one.
They're stunning. Absolutely stunning.
There we go. Sign on the dotted line.
So when receiving oysters, give them a bit of a smell, make sure there's no bad smells, picking the oysters up, making sure that they're fully closed and they're full of water. You can feel when the oyster's still got all their water in them and the ones that are a bit lighter. Use the ones that are lighter first. So this one is one of the empty dry ones that's been sitting right in the bag, and this is perfect. When we've opened it up, you can see there's a lot of moisture and all that beautiful seawater ready to go. We place them into the tray upright, that way again the water doesn't drip out of it. So once we've got them all in the tray, they're nice and upright, we get the hessian bag, dampen it with a bit of water. Remember, it's got the salt from the oysters in already, which is going to help it, over the top, and then we place them into the cooler.
Preparation. Cooking method. Shallow frying.
Cookery method for shallow frying. Heavy base fry pan, top quality Australian vegetable oil, finely ground Australian chickpea flour, freshly shucked oysters, paper towel for draining, and of course a pair of tongs. To prevent the hot oil spitting and burns, make sure you dry your oyster before putting in the batter. To test the temperature of the oil before shallow frying, just drop a little bit of the batter into the pan, and if it sinks to the bottom, it's not hot enough. If it stays on the top, nice and frothy, then it's ready. This one is not quite ready, 2 more minutes, perfect. So once the oil is at the correct temperature, take your oyster into the chickpea batter, just getting rid of a little bit of the excess batter. Now don't drop it into the pan because it'll sink to the bottom and stick. What you're trying to do is just gently seal the bottom of the batter, just like this. Once again, oyster into the batter, wave off excess, gently sear the underneath of the oyster. With a clean pair of tongs, Turn the oysters over so they get a beautiful even colour brown, and then take the oyster from the pan and put on the absorbent paper. Very easy to serve, shallow frying. So there you have it, shallow fried, freshly shucked Australian oysters.